Welcome back to the Dynamic Growth Podcast. My name is Nate Crosby, and I am joined with Derek Ballinger. Derek, today we are going to talk about the stimulus package and what that means for our investments.
If you like the episode, share it with a friend. Like us on Instagram and Facebook at Dynamic Growth Pod. And let's get into it, Nate.
All right, Derek, we have a $1.9 trillion stimulus package that has been passed. Many Americans have already began to receive their checks in the mail or auto-deposited. I want to kind of talk about what that means for you and I as investors, what that means for younger generations. I think it's past time to sound the alarm, to be a little bit concerned about what's going on, namely inflation, which as of right now, we don't have a problem with it. But I don't know how that doesn't become a problem going into the future, and I'm going to get into why that is. And then the other thing that we've got coming here on the horizon is tax increases. So how do we prepare our investments so that we can thrive and also benefit from the stimulus package?
Right. And I mean, let's get back to like the roots of the stimulus package, like why they passed it in the first place. I mean, basically, what we were faced with in March was we shut down the biggest machine on earth, and that's the American economy, where nobody was working, nobody was making anything. Everybody was asked to stay at home unless you were what they called an essential business. And they sort of used a stimulus package to sort of help everybody out and get the gears moving again. And I think the biggest takeaway from the stimulus package was it drastically increased the size of government. Since the New Deal, I can't really think of a time where the government stepped in the way they did to assist individuals. But I'm also not like a history buffer, or I'm not a history expert. I wouldn't really know, but that's as far back as the New Deal, this is the first time I can think of that.
Yeah. Do you remember years ago, they would show the debt clock that was kind of running, and it was showing how fast the debt was rising? I haven't seen it since the 3 rounds of stimulus, but I imagine that's in hyperdrive right now.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it had a couple big jumps there. Yeah. I mean, the first stimulus bill was $2 trillion, and then they had like an $800 billion one, or was it the one with the $600 checks?
Right.
And then they just passed this most recent one for $1.9 trillion.
Yeah.
It's monopoly money. They're just
at this point in time, right?
Money.
It's monopoly money.
Yeah.
So, and that's what concerns me. If I look at, I don't want this episode to be political, but from an investor's point of view, we have tax increases coming. And you could say, well, those are only for the corporations. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it's only for the corporations, but eventually that buck gets passed down. We're taking money that we don't have, pushing it into the system. We're looking at, they were not able to do it with this round of stimulus, but they tried to get the minimum wage put into that stimulus package so it would go up to $15 an hour, which seems like quite a hike compared to what it is now. Any one of those three potentially could cause inflation down the road. Over the next couple of years, we're likely looking at all three of those in some form or fashion. So how do I inflation-proof and tax-proof my portfolio? How do I use this stimulus check to benefit from? Because let's be real. Looking at a Yahoo Harris poll, it was published, Yahoo Finance Harris poll that was published over the weekend here. What they found was that 57% of Americans were not planning on using their stimulus check to buy necessities, to pay for their mortgage, the basic living needs that they have. Now, there was a decent percentage of the population that does need that. But over half of it said they do not. And some of them, 7%, said they're going to buy cryptocurrencies, which going forward here, I'm not against that. I think we need to get ahead of inflation. And I want to lay out a strategy on how you do that.
The theory behind stimulus and how it's supposed to stimulate the economy is something called the multiplier effect in economics, where basically, like if you give cash to people, that they would go and spend it at their favorite restaurants, the restaurants would go and spend that money to like their suppliers, and then that kind of tripled. It's the same money being spent many times in the economy. And then you can think of like an opposite example of something that wouldn't have the multiplier effect would be like bombs for the military, where you spend all this money and then it's immediately evaporated. Like that would be the opposite of an economic stimulus. But when our government has done stimulus in the past, only 20% of the recipients spent the money, and 32% put it into savings, and then the rest of the people use the money to pay off debt. So sometimes that multiplier effect, when people talk about it, it's more so theory and maybe not as intended in actual application.
Yeah. If I look at our leaders in government right now, we got Nancy Pelosi's been in office for 32 years. Mitch McConnell has been in office for 36 years. Chuck Schumer has been in office for 38 years. Joe Biden has been public servant in Washington for 44 years. The stimulus package that has been passed is not their problem. They're not the ones that are going to have to pay for this in the future. It's going to be us. It's going to be our children. It's going to be people who are not even yet born. And so I would say the first thing that I would do is, if I was worried about inflation, if I was worried about tax hikes down the road, is I would get myself financially healthy. So if I had the stimulus check and I did not need it to pay my mortgage, I did not need it to pay for groceries, to pay utility bills, the first thing I might do with it is, if I had high interest debt, I might look to get myself a little bit more financially healthy so that I can get myself out of debt. And then moving forward, I can begin with the positive net worth and that we're accumulating assets. So credit card debt, boom, pay that down. Student loans, if it's a high student loan debt, pay that down. Anything, what is considered high interest debt? That's really an individual question. Personally, the way I look at it is anything over 5%, I'm looking to pay down. I'm not looking to pay down my house. My house is at 3.2%. That's cheap money. I'm not looking to pay that down. But anything over 5%, I would be looking to pay down.
That's one of the things that I've been struggling with, is whether to continue paying on student loans or not. I have private and public student loans, and the private student loans have crazy high interest. It's really insane how they're allowed to charge an 18-year-old kid 10% interest on a $30,000 loan.
Right.
It's pretty insane. But with all these, we talked about the minimum wage and all these progressive policies, which are, I'm not making a normative judgment. I'm just saying, with this administration, one of the things on the bucket list was $10,000 paid off in student loans. So it's been, and on top of that, they've halted the interest payments on those. They aren't accumulating interest, which is it's actually really helpful, but it does kind of create a dilemma on whether or not I should be spending money paying off those loans or investing or any other thing that I could do with the money.
Yeah. What do you feel about the fact that, there's somebody who did not go to college, graduated from high school, went and got a job? What do you think about, I went to college too, I had student debt as well. What do you feel about them potentially having to pay the burden of that? Not you in particular, but if they were having loan forgiveness.
Right. Yeah, right. That is, it's an interesting topic. We could probably do a whole podcast just on student loan forgiveness. It's a tough one. At the same time, obviously I can't make a good quality judgment because I'm obviously biased because I have student loan debt. It doesn't seem like a possibility is to just let people let this debt go on for your 60 years of life, or however, if you took it out when you're 20, however long this debt goes on. I mean, some people have $250,000 in student loan debt and they have a degree in, I know we don't degree shame, but it's there's some degrees that aren't going to be able to pay off to $250,000 of student loan debt from NYU or one of these. I just watched that. I told you I watched that documentary on
admissions.
The college admission scandal. So I know I brushed up on how much college is, but yeah, I mean, so I don't really know what to do because you can't default on the loans. You can't. You're never going to pay them off. Your grandkids are going to be paying this off. It's just, I really don't know what to do. But at the same time, yeah, you bring up a good point where, I mean, that's really, really not fair for somebody that maybe wanted to go to college and didn't go because of the costs, and then they turned around and forgave all of the loans where just, a good portion of those loans were irresponsibly spent. If your college is paid for, maybe you wouldn't, make the same spending decisions where if you were footing the bill through the entire way.
Yeah. And some of that might be chalked off to being young and naive. But at some point in time, don't you have...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Don't you have to ask the question?
18-year-olds are stupid. I say that all the time.
Well, everybody was at 18 years old, right? But at some point in time, there also is a personal responsibility. If I'm going to rack up $200,000 in student loans, I need to be able to have a job that's going to be able to pay for that. I need to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, something that is going to garner enough income in order to pay that off. I don't know. It's a problem for sure. I just don't see how it's fair to pass that off on to somebody else who maybe didn't go to college.
Right. Yeah.
So
it's all monopoly money, though. So it's like, will we ever? Yeah. I mean, for how long we've gotten away with it, it's not apparent that we would ever have to. We can. It might be the case that we can just keep passing the buck down the road. It doesn't seem likely. I mean, who knows? Nobody knows. When you can create $4 trillion out of thin air, I would say nothing's impossible.
Yeah. So that's kind of my point, is that if we are going to keep kicking this can down the road, and by all things that we see now, there's no stop to that. We're going to continue to kick that can down the road. So what do we do in order to prepare for that? Prepare for tax hikes in order to pay for this, and also potential inflation that might come from it. So as I said, my number one strategy would be to pay down debt. Get yourself financially healthy. But let's assume that you don't have that. Let's assume that you don't have high interest debt. What are the next things you can do? I would be looking to take advantage of growth securities. I want to be in something that outpaces that inflation growth. So I'm going to be in stocks, growth stocks, dividend stocks, something that has the ability, long-term history of beating that inflation.
Yeah, and that's what I've told friends. Like, people will text me that, hey, I got the stimmy. I'm like, make sure you're buying assets. That's what I told them.
Yeah.
Because it's like, yeah. I mean, definitely don't keep it in a savings account. If you plan on using that money for savings, do not keep it in a savings account. That's what I would say.
Yeah. If I look at things that benefit from inflation, one of the types of securities that pop up a lot of times, and people add this to your portfolio or a portfolio in order to take advantage of inflation, Treasury inflation protected securities, or they go by TIPS. And essentially what these are fixed income instruments that the principal goes up when inflation rises. And so it pays a certain interest rate. But let's assume that we have a bond that pays 1.5%. And we're in it for a period of time. What happens if inflation grows above 1.5%? Now all of a sudden we're in an instrument that is losing spending power, right? So the way that these TIPS work is if inflation goes up, the principal will go up so that it's keeping that growth above inflation. I'm still not a giant fan of them, only because I still think that long term, especially if I'm holding this in a taxable account, I'm going to have a hard time significantly outpacing inflation. There's something that is available to us, but I probably wouldn't be my go-to. I mentioned my top would be growth securities, but believe it or not, real estate typically benefits from inflation. So you could do that with a rental property, or you could put that into your home. You have to be careful if you're going to put it into your home. The hard part is getting it out, because how do I get it out? To get it out, you're likely going to sell the house. And if you sell the house, there's actually some tax preferential treatment to that real estate. If I'm a single tax filer, I can shield up to $250,000 of profit from taxation. And if I'm married, Derek, you actually have asked me, what are the benefits of being married? Well, one of the benefits is that if I'm married, I can shield up to $500,000 of profit from the sale of my home.
We should do a podcast on that.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because as I was researching for this podcast, there was a couple of things that came up that I realized, there's a good reason to be married, other than the fact that you love your spouse. But
yeah, nothing says love like signing government papers
and a financial contract, right? But the other thing that you can do is you could take equity out of your house, right? You could pull equity out of your house. The problem is, though, you have to ask the bank permission for that. And then, of course, the bank is going to charge you interest on that equity. So probably not the most ideal situation. We just talked about getting yourself financially healthy, getting out of debt. Taking an equity line of credit would actually add debt to you.
Well, I mean, what some people do is people that invest in real estate, they'll take out the equity in a property they have and then use that money to buy other properties. That could be an option, but I don't know how many real estate tycoons we have listening. Next week we have one as a guest.
Next week maybe next week you can answer that question for us. So yeah, that works in a perfect situation, right? If you take the equity out and you buy a rental property, and then it cash flows and you can pay down that debt. And then of course you can imagine a situation where it doesn't cash flow, where you lose a tenant, or there's problems with the rental property, where that could also create a situation where you have two debts now: the rental property and your equity line of credit. The thing that I would avoid, Derek, if we're talking about inflation, especially right now, is long-term fixed income. So I'm not interested in being in a bond for the next 20 years if interest rates are going to go up and if there's a possibility that inflation is going to go up. So I would steer clear of long-term fixed income. I don't know if it was our last podcast or a couple podcasts ago, we talked about some of the changes we have made to our portfolios, and we discussed how that fixed income portion has been drastically moved to the short-term position with investment grade.
Yeah. So this is sort of a relevant topic. We saw, like in around like the past month at least, or past couple weeks, there's been a big pullback in growth stocks because of the increased yields on the 10-year notes. And so I think maybe if you could go into, like, I don't really understand why that makes long-term growth stocks less favorable. I know because of the added volatility, but to me, that doesn't really change the prospects of like an Apple or a Microsoft. I think, what I've been doing and what we've been doing is buying these stocks on the discount, but I just don't understand why that correlates with maybe the decrease in price.
Okay, so that's a good question. I think number one, we need to go back to pay more attention to the companies you're investing in. Long term, if we're investing in great companies, we should have great results in our investment products. But one of the reasons why growth stocks get spooked when yields go up is, so we have a recovery taking place. And some people believe that we're ahead of schedule and that things are actually looking maybe a little bit rosier than the Fed thought they were going to be. So even though the Fed has, based on their last meeting, said we don't plan on raising rates through 2023, there's some people that believe that that actually might come sooner and that they're going to be forced to raise rates in order to, the Fed has a dual mandate, right? They need to keep inflation low or at least in check. And they also have to keep as close to full employment, or their goal is to be as close to full employment as possible. So those are the two mandates that they have. Well, when we have the potential of rising rates, that hurts growth stocks because growth stocks typically are what? Young companies. Some of them are saddled with debt. They've taken out debt, cheap debt, in order to grow their company, and they're putting everything back in. Some of these growth stocks maybe not yet profitable yet. So if they don't have a healthy cash flow, and if they're in rising rates, and maybe they're in variable rates, some of their investments might be in variable investments. I should say not variable investments, variable interest rates on their debt. Well, that would hurt their growth because number one, if they need new money, they have to go get it more expensively, and the existing debt that they have might cut into their cash flow.
I still am of the belief that I'm still purchasing a lot of the names that we talked about a lot on the podcast, a lot of the high growth. Well, I'm not buying them because they're high growth. I'm buying them because I believe that over the next 5 to 10 years, they will continue to have high growth rates and everything.
If you look at the stocks, the companies that are in our tactical model, these are companies that are, I believe, part of the new economy. We've got a lot of cloud companies. We've got a lot of tech. We have financials, which we believe are going to benefit from this recovery. And right. I don't think that changes. Even though we're going to have short-term periods of time where maybe growth suffers or value might come into play, I think that long-term you just want to be in companies that are leaders in their space, and you want to be in companies that are changing the world.
So another thing I wanted to go back to the stimulus. Do you think that the stimulus kind of creates a moral hazard, not so much for, it might create it for individuals, but I'm not as concerned about the moral hazard as individuals, but rather like the big corporations that also receive stimulus, like the banks or like the airlines, for example, where now there's not really a reason to keep a significant amount of cash, like doomsday cash around when you know that the government's going to step in and bail everybody out, like if stuff gets rough.
Yeah, they're essentially training the dog, right? They're training the dog that there's no responsibility, and that's kind of my take on this, or my comment on the student loans and everything else. I think we've lost that in our society. To use an analogy, and I apologize, I've talked to you about this before, Derek, but I know that there are people out there that are hurting, and for me to sit here and say that's not a reality, I know that they're hurting. But I also am a little concerned for my children that we have lost our ability as Americans to deal with short-term pain, my opinion. And the analogy that I use is the boat has capsized. And most parents, most responsible adults, if the boat capsizes and we've got men, women, and children, we're into the water, and most people would take the children, keep their heads above water, and swim like heck to get to a raft, right? And they would endure that short-term pain in order to promote the younger generation, to save that younger generation. In many ways, I look at what we have done, and this stems all the way back to the Great Recession in 2008. Our answer was to print money, right? Our answer was to bail out. And we solved every problem by sticking more money into the system. And I almost see us as what we're doing is the boat has capsized. And instead of holding the children above water, we're pushing them under so that we can get to the boat. And that concerns me. I mean, think about these people who are yet born or are in grade school. You're a young guy, Derek. I mean, you're in your early 20s. You're going to have to face this, me both. I mean, I'm still a relatively young guy at 43. I think there's going to come time. I realize that we keep kicking this can down the road, but I don't see how this continues to happen without tax increases and without inflation to pay for it.
Yeah. And like from an economic standpoint, it's not so much inflation. That's not the big worry. It's inflation coupled with low growth. Like if we ever reach a point where, like, I mean, that was the big worry back in March where like nothing was happening and we were also creating like $4 trillion in debt where like, because inflation is kind of driven by like high demand, which raises prices when you hold like sort of income constant. That's what causes inflation. But if you have all of this, these raises in prices, but like let's say wages decrease, like the unemployment rate goes crazy high, and you have sort of, it's called stagflation. Like that's the real worry. That's sort of what happened. Like I don't know if you read the story a couple of years ago about Venezuela, where they would have like their dollar bills were like hundreds of trillions of dollars, and or I think Zimbabwe was another one where they have like $100 trillion bills. It's just crazy stories. But that's the real worry where we can't, where we're in a situation where the only thing we have that keeps our economy moving is stimulus, and we don't actually make anything. Like that's what worries me more than like printing money or like short-term inflation.
It's known as a zombie economy, I believe, right? When the only thing that's keeping it going
Right.
is not progress and innovation in industry, it's the government printing money.
Right.
Yeah. So as far as things that we could do, so yeah, I've got my stimulus check and I don't need it for my necessities. We already talked about some of the things that can benefit from inflation. Commodities are another one that can benefit from inflation. But one of the tools that a lot of Americans have in their tool belt is the Roth IRA. And the Roth IRA is an instrument that allows an investor to contribute to it as long as you're under a certain gross adjusted income and you're not taking a tax deduction. But then forever going forward, that can grow tax-free. And as long as I keep the Roth IRA open for at least 5 years, then when I pull that out in retirement years, I can pull the entire amount out tax-free. And that's super powerful. So if I was a parent and I was worried about my children, well, maybe open up a minor Roth IRA. You can actually open up a Roth IRA for a child. Now, that child has to have earned income. But that earned income could be, especially if you're a business owner, take advantage of this. I mean, that earned income could be the child cleaning your office or sweeping floors or doing something that is, as long as they're of relatively decent age, right? I've got a 10-year-old. There's no reason why a 10-year-old can't clean the office or something like that. So you could take that $1,400 stimulus check, put it into a minor Roth IRA, grow that for the next 50 years at 10% income or whatever the historic return is of the S&P 500. And that $1,400 in 50 years turns into $81,000. So, and that's just one $1,400. Imagine if you were able to add that, every year going forward into the account. You could set yourself up into a position where the child up into a position where if tax rates became crazy going into the future, inflation became crazy going into the future, well, maybe they've got a giant buffer here. That Roth IRA shields them from those taxes. And hopefully we're able to keep ahead of the inflation through the growth of the gross securities.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I don't have any. I don't have kids or anything like that. But if I had a 3-year-old, I'd probably try to find a way to game the system.
But you,
that my 3-year-old mows the lawn.
But you should be taking advantage of a Roth IRA right now, and let me tell you why. You're a smart guy. There's going to come a time, probably in your near future, that you're not able to contribute to a Roth IRA because you're going to make too much money. And so you got to take advantage of it now while you can.
Thanks.
Well, you're going to. You're going to. I mean, look at yourself. I mean, you've got a bright future ahead of you. So plan for it now. I would say contribute to the Roth IRA. You know, whatever you can stick in there, stuff in as much as possible. And then when you get to the point where you can no longer contribute to it, let it ride.
Nice. I'll look into that. I'll open one with Crosby Advisory.
There you go.
You're quite the salesman.
Another thing that you could do, and this is probably not something that you would do, but let's say that you're a parent, and let's say you're a grandparent, and you're worried about the next generation. You're worried about taking care of your grandkids. One of the things you can do, assuming that you're still healthy to qualify for that, is life insurance. I'm not talking about the cash value of life insurance. I'm talking about the life insurance itself, the benefit, which you, the policyholder, will not benefit from, but your beneficiary will. And I would challenge you to find a better return on investment for the beneficiary than the life insurance policy, because you can buy dollars for pennies. And in addition to that, that beneficiary can receive that life insurance benefit tax-free. Pretty sweet deal.
Yeah, that's a pretty good idea. We're dropping bombs today.
We're dropping
We got some
bombs.
good ideas.
Roth IRA, real estate, life insurance. Those are 3 things that potentially could shield you from taxes in the future.
I think we talked about on the Bitcoin podcast sort of the general thesis for Bitcoin as a store of value, because the ultimate supply of 21 million coins is fixed and that could never be changed. I think we did a pretty good job at laying out its relation to inflation in that episode. Go check that one out. That was a pretty good one. But I mean, I always am weary of telling people to invest in cryptocurrency because like nobody really knows. It's so young, like nobody really knows what it is. And I always say like I would rather lose $1,000 than have like somebody I told to invest in something lose $1. So I mean, hopefully I'm right, and I will give people the best information that I have. But it's still so young that I can't really make a prediction.
Yeah, I mean, all investing has risk.
Yeah, right.
All investing has risk. We of course have a longer track history with stocks than we do cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrency is only about a decade old, so not in the relative, grand scheme of things, that's a pretty short period of time.
I wanted to go back to talking about the stimulus and like why we did it in the first place. I think one of the errors that was made in I really, it's such a complex issue with so many different things going on. It's hard to make a definitive judgment about what was wrong. But I do think that if the government was gonna ask people, I know we did a complete 180, I'm sorry, but if the government was gonna ask people to stay home and try to put yourself in the mind frame of where we were in March, where everyone thought it was the bubonic plague and we thought 10% of the population was gonna die. It's you can't ask everybody to stay home and not give them anything. So I think that the stimulus in the first place, I think that it was a necessity where they had to do something. You can't just ask people not to work and then be like, yeah, figure it out for yourself, because this was sprung on everybody. Like nobody could have seen this coming. I mean, yeah, you can always say there's probably going to be a pandemic sometime in the future, judging off history, but this was kind of a surprise. I don't think anybody can be held responsible for not being prepared for this, but at the same time, you can't create $4 trillion out of thin air and expect nothing to happen.
I would agree with you. I think that I don't know a whole lot of people that would argue that point. So when it first happened, I was on board too. I mean, we were working from home, and because you're right, nobody knew what this was going to be, and all the news that came out about how contagious it was, and it's very, very contagious, obviously. Looking back, and this is hindsight, I don't know if they would have completely shut down the economy like they did.
Judging off, where a lot of people stand right now, I would think that like given the same information, the response, and it might have been just never like a shift in response, but yeah, I mean it's kind of hindsight's 2020. It's kind of hard to predict what would have happened if we had the information we have now.
I would agree with you. I think the decisions that they made had to be made because they had to err on the side of caution. Because if they wouldn't have, it was the bubonic plague, then man, I mean that would have been disaster. So yeah, you're right. I mean, we're talking about hindsight, and you're never going to change the history. I just think that I think once we realize what it was, I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answers either. I just know that what we can do is going forward is prepare. And if I was an investor, as we discussed before, one of the things I would be worried about is tax hikes and inflation. And so I would prepare for it. I would get ahead of that curve as much as possible. I would get ahead of it as if I was being chased by a cheetah. I mean, run now.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't think that we're going to see anything. I mean, knock on wood, I don't think that we're going to see anything like hyperinflation like we discussed like with Venezuela or Zimbabwe or like Germany in the 1940s or 1930s. I don't think it's going to be anything like that. But yeah, inflation is definitely a real thing. And there's definitely going to be some consequence to printing this much money and adding this much juice into the system. And I think, yeah, buying assets is what I've been telling everybody to do.
Buy assets that appreciate over time. Yep.
Cash flowing assets. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. Your savings accounts, stuffing it in the mattress and the coffee can in the backyard, not a good idea.
Yeah. Cash is a bad long-term investment.
Well, Derek, anything else to add before we head out into the week? I imagine there's a lot of things that we can improve upon, but we'll get better going forward.
I'm sure.
Do you know what?
Number one is my background. I didn't break my rule where like you ever see like people recording podcasts with all these books. I'm like, how many of those books did you actually read? I read all of those.
Those are journals.
I only put a book out. Okay,
these are journals.
I only put a book out if I read it.
Yes.
So I read all those
there you
books.
Go. Do you know one of the things that...
and my chessboard.
One of the things I wanted to mention at the beginning of the podcast that I wasn't able to is I think it's important that the listeners know that is you're no longer able to wear medium shirts.
Oh, yeah, I'm huge, dude. This is a medium. You see, like, I'm trying to make it work, but yeah, like, see the pinches up at the shoulder. Yeah. I'm huge.
I think the term that they use now is swole, right? You're swole?
Yeah, sure. I'm swole, bro.
There you go. All right. Well, always remember Crosby Advisory is a registered investment advisor in the state of Ohio. At any time, you can request our forms ADV 2A and 2B, which go into the business practices and qualifications of Crosby Advisory. Keep in mind that investing involves risk, and you should carefully consider all risks and fees before making an investment. Crosby Advisory is also a licensed insurance advisor. Insurance products are sold and serviced through Crosby Advisory.